Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.
Friends of Islam, this time the Islamic faith is back before you to share Islamic information. I hope it inspires your activities today. And don't forget to click the subscribe button and activate the bell button notifications, so you don't miss the latest news from the Islamic Faith channel. Imagine a magnificent cathedral in the heart of America, where Christian prayers usually echo. Suddenly, the atmosphere changes as the melodious call to prayer envelops the room. Amid the sturdy wooden benches, an imam stands at a podium, reciting verses from the Quran about unity.
من ذكر وأنثى وجعلناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا.
Hundreds of attendees, including President Donald Trump, fall silent in contemplation. No one could have imagined that this moment would be the beginning of an extraordinary spiritual journey, where a renowned pastor and his church congregation discover the light of Islam. What really happened? How could one prayer in church change so many lives? Check out this shocking true story. A historic event. A cathedral stands majestically in the heart of the United States Capitol. This Gothic architectural building is not just a place of worship, but also a witness to many historical events. Beneath its high ceilings and colorful stained glass windows, great figures from various generations have gathered to pray, make vows, or simply reflect on the direction of the nation. That day, the atmosphere inside the cathedral was silent, yet filled with tension. Hundreds of religious leaders from various faiths gathered for a sacred event, the National Prayer Service. The tradition has been going on for more than 2 centuries, aimed at reunifying the American nation after a tumultuous presidential election. Among the attendees were Catholics, Protestants, and Episcopalians. Also present were representatives from the Jewish and Muslim communities. All carried the hope that prayer and togetherness could be a bridge for a divided nation. The presence of Donald Trump, the newly inaugurated President of the United States, was the main focus. He sat in the front row wearing a black suit with his signature red tie. This moment was a crucial test. Could he embrace all parties after his controversial political campaign? During his campaign, Trump often made harsh statements against Muslims, immigrants, and other minority groups. But that day, under the shadow of the sacred cathedral, something unexpected happened. He had called for a ban on Muslims entering America, proposed stricter surveillance of mosques, and spoken in a divisive tone. So many wondered why this man, who has often been considered anti-Muslim, was now sitting amid religious leaders, listening to prayers that emphasize unity and tolerance. In another corner of the room, a brown-skinned man stepped up to the podium. His attire was simple, a long white robe and a small turban around his head. He was Imam Muhammad Maikit, a prominent cleric from the Aldous Area Muslim Society Center, who had been invited to represent Muslims at the event. His steps were calm, but as he stood in front of the podium, he looked out at the audience, whose expressions now varied. Some were hopeful, some skeptical, and some uncomfortable. As he took a breath to begin, silence fell over the room. No one expected that something rare inside this great church would soon take place. Meanwhile, outside, the Washington National Cathedral stood as a symbol of spirituality and unity. The streets around it were lined with security barriers. Dozens of Secret Service agents stood guard at every corner, making sure there was no threat to the guest of honor. That day, President Donald Trump arrived at the Washington National Cathedral. A black motorcade slowly made its way to the cathedral's main entrance. As the presidential limousine door swung open, Trump stepped out with a solemn expression. The biting winter air did not change his expression, which remained impassive. His eyes scanned the grand building before him. He walked up the steps, greeted by several church officials who had been waiting at the entrance. Inside the cathedral, the atmosphere was tense. Although the event was intended to rekindle unity, it was undeniable that many in the room still harbored doubts about Trump. A number of religious leaders from various faiths tried to maintain a professional demeanor, but tension was still palpable. Trump stepped into the cathedral's main chamber. Sunlight poured through the stained glass windows, casting beautiful colors on the marble floor. He walked past rows of benches where religious leaders sat in silence. His eyes swept around the room. The faces looking at him wore varying expressions, some neutral, some hopeful, and some skeptical. He realized that not everyone in the room was his supporter. In the front row, several Episcopal and Catholic clergymen greeted him with small nods. A rabbi from the Jewish community gave him a thin smile. From a distance, a shaved Buddhist monk stared at him with an unreadable expression. But one figure caught Trump's attention more than the others. A brown-skinned man in a long white robe and a small turban. He sat quietly among the clergy. His face was clean, his eyes serene. He was Imam Muhammad Mead, a representative of the American Muslim community. Trump knew this was no ordinary cleric. Imam Mead had long been known as a champion of interfaith dialogue and tolerance. He often spoke about how Islam could live side by side with other faiths in peace. His presence at this event was meaningful, and for Trump, perhaps a little uncomfortable. Before taking a seat, Trump took a deep breath. He had never been known for being religious. He rarely spoke about religion, except in a political context. But today he was in a cathedral, flanked by figures from different faiths, listening to prayers that spoke of unity, compassion, and forgiveness. A chair had been set aside for him in the front row. As he sat, he felt eyes on him from all directions. The event began with a prayer from a Christian priest. His words emphasized the importance of unity, compassion, and wise leadership. Trump listened with a blank expression. His hands were folded on the bench, his thoughts hard to guess. Then prayers were offered by other religious leaders. A Jewish rabbi spoke of the values of justice and wisdom in leadership. A Hindu leader spoke of the importance of balance and peace. A Buddhist monk quoted the teaching of compassion. Then it was time for Imam Muhammad Mead to speak. With a calm stride, he stood and walked to the podium. The atmosphere grew quieter. For some in the room, it was a meaningful moment. A Muslim standing in front of a Christian cathedral, about to deliver a message of Islam to a president who had spoken of banning Muslims from entering America. Imam Mead took a breath. He looked at the audience with complete serenity. Then in a soft but confident voice, he uttered something unexpected. The call to prayer echoed through the cathedral. At that moment, the atmosphere changed drastically. The audience, including President Donald Trump, stared at him intently. No one knew for sure what he was going to say before, but now they were all silent, listening. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. The sacred words filled the cathedral with grandeur. Imam Mead's voice vibrated softly, carrying a deep spiritual nuance. Yet the voice remained strong, filling the silence with meaningful chanting. The moment was so shocking. Some of the audience looked shocked, their eyes wide as if they couldn't believe that they were actually hearing the call to prayer inside a Christian church. Donald Trump himself looked stunned. His originally flat expression now showed disbelief. His blue eyes stared at Imam Mead, as if trying to understand what was happening. Several people in the room bowed their heads, not because they objected, but because they felt something different, a sacred feeling that transcended religious boundaries. In fact, some Christian figures sitting in the front row looked moved. Their eyes were slightly teary. However, not everyone felt comfortable. In another corner of the room, some guests looked restless. They whispered to each other, wondering if this was really part of the event or something that shouldn't happen. But Imam Mead continued his call to prayer with sincerity. He was not affected by the mixed reactions from the audience. For him, this holy call was not just an ordinary chant, but a spiritual message that penetrated the barriers of difference. When the call to prayer reached its end, the imam's voice trembled slightly. The atmosphere in the cathedral was so quiet, as if everyone was digesting the meaning of what they had just witnessed. Some were praying, some were pensive, and some looked emotional. Imam Mead closed his eyes for a moment, as if feeling the weight of the message he had just delivered. The audience remained silent. Some of them seemed to be contemplating. Even Trump, who is known as a man who often speaks loudly, said nothing. Then from the corner of the room, soft applause was heard. A Christian pastor sitting in the front row clapped his hands gently, followed by several others. The applause was not thunderous, but it was enough to show that many understood the significance of the moment. Not everyone in the room agreed, however. Some guests shook their heads while others sat there in silence. But one thing was for sure, something rare had just happened. The call to prayer, usually heard only in mosques or in Muslim communities, had now echoed through one of America's most historic churches. And in the midst of it all, Donald Trump sat silently, contemplating something he probably never imagined. After the call to prayer had died down, Imam Muhammad Mead stood at the podium. The atmosphere in Washington National Cathedral was still silent. Some in the audience seemed stunned by what they had just heard. Donald Trump remained silent. His eyes narrowed slightly as if trying to comprehend the situation. He did not react immediately, but it was clear that the call to prayer that echoed through the church had left a deep impression. The call to prayer was not just a call to Muslims, but a universal message for all of humanity. An elderly Episcopal priest smiled slightly, his eyes sparkling. A Jewish rabbi sitting not far from Trump appeared to be contemplating. Even a Buddhist monk closed his eyes as if absorbing the essence of the verse he had just recited. But the most striking sight was Donald Trump himself. His face was still hard to read, but his eyes had changed. He no longer looked as tense or stiff as before. There was something in Imam Mead's words that seemed to make him think more deeply. The message of unity in the verse was so clear that humans were created different, not to be enemies, but to know and understand each other. That the measure of a person's greatness is not their race, ethnicity, or social status, but their piety, something much deeper and beyond mere appearance. Imam Mead paused, letting his words sink into the hearts of the audience. Then he spoke again, this time in a softer tone, as if speaking directly to each person in the room. Differences are destiny, but how we deal with them is our choice. The words were simple, but they were so profound. An elderly woman in the back row wiped the corners of her eyes. The middle-aged man who had initially appeared skeptical now lowered his head, as if contemplating something. Trump remained silent. He showed no sign of commenting or overreacting. But from the way he looked at Imam Mead, it was clear that the words had touched something deep within him. That day, something unexpected had happened. Inside the International Cathedral, differences were no longer a barrier. People from different backgrounds and beliefs sat together, listening to the same message, that unity cannot be built through hatred, but through love. Donald Trump may have, for the first time, begun to realize the enormity of his responsibility as a leader, not just to embrace his supporters, but also his entire nation. But would this message change the way he thought and acted? That was the question that hung in the air. As the recitation of the Quran ended, silence still enveloped the room. The holy verse had been solemnly recited, carrying a message of unity that echoed before President Donald Trump. But the silence did not last long. As the formal event ended and attendees began to leave the cathedral, controversy quickly erupted. Among those who attended this event, there were those whose hearts were moved. An Episcopal priest who attended called the event a beautiful reminder that we are all part of one humanity. Several religious leaders from across the faith expressed their appreciation for Imam Muhammad Mead's courage in bringing the message of Islam to such an unusual place. One Jewish rabbi told the media, "We live in a divided world. What happened today is a small step toward a deeper understanding." Even among Christians, some saw the event as a symbol of openness and tolerance. A middle-aged woman who attended the event said in an interview, "God is not confined to one religion. If we can pray together, maybe we can live together in peace." However, not everyone felt the same way. It didn't take long for criticism to begin, especially from conservative Christians who hold to traditional teachings. Many of them were uncomfortable with the fact that the Adhan, the Muslim call to prayer, was being sung inside a Christian cathedral. A conservative priest from Texas, in an interview with the media, said, "The church is the house of God for Christians. To allow the chanting of prayers from another religion inside is an affront to our faith. For some, this is a serious issue. Some Episcopalians have even said they are considering leaving their church because they are upset with the leaders who allowed this event to happen." On social media, similar reactions have emerged. Many conservatives see this as a sign of the Islamization of America, despite the fact that the event was intended to foster interfaith dialogue. However, criticism has not only come from Christians. Among Muslims themselves, some conservative groups have expressed their dismay at Imam Mid's decision to recite the call to prayer inside a church. They feel that it is not an appropriate place to proclaim the Islamic call to prayer. Some clerics have even openly criticized the decision. One conservative Muslim figure from the Middle East commented, "Islam teaches us to respect other religions, but not by mixing places of worship." On various online forums, some Muslims have also questioned Imam Mid's reasoning for attending the event, especially given Donald Trump's campaign rhetoric, which has often been seen as denigrating Islam. Trump has spoken of banning Muslims from entering the United States. Now the call to prayer is being revered in front of him. "This is like giving legitimacy to people who disrespect us," wrote one Twitter user known as a Muslim activist. However, on the other hand, many Muslims actually support Imam Mid's move. They see this as an opportunity to show the peaceful and tolerant face of Islam. A Muslim student from New York wrote, "If we want to be heard and respected, we must speak up." Meanwhile, Donald Trump remained silent. He did not immediately comment after the event ended. Even in the official statement from the White House, there was not a single word that specifically mentioned this incident. However, several sources in Trump's inner circle said that he was indeed surprised by what happened at the cathedral. A close advisor told the media, Trump did not expect the call to prayer to be called, but he listened. He was silent for a long time after the event was over. But will this affect his views on Islam? Or will it just be a momentary moment forgotten amid the hustle and bustle of American politics? That is the big question that still hangs in the minds of many. What happened that day at Washington National Cathedral has certainly left a lasting impression for both supporters and opponents. And amidst all the controversy, one thing is clear. The call to prayer had echoed through an American cathedral, and the world had watched. As the ceremony wrapped up and attendees began to file out of Washington National Cathedral, the atmosphere inside the cathedral was still different. It was as if the echoes of the call to prayer and the chanting of the holy texts had just been heard still hung in the air. Some walked around with thoughtful expressions, while others whispered among themselves, discussing what had just happened. In the emptying room, Donald Trump remained silent. He did not rise as he usually does at formal events. Not because he was confused, but like someone trying to process something he had not expected. An advisor approached him and whispered, "President, we can go now." Trump looked up, stared at the man for a moment, then nodded slowly. But before standing, his eyes glanced toward the podium where Imam Muhammad Mid had previously stood. Trump has long been known for his harsh rhetoric against Islam. He has suggested a Muslim ban, proposed strict monitoring of mosques, and openly voiced skepticism of the Muslim community in America. But that day, he sat inside the church and listened attentively to the call to prayer and verses from the Quran. Would this change him? Not necessarily, but one thing was for sure. This moment stirred something in his mind. When he walked out of the cathedral, cameras were waiting for him. Journalists flooded him with questions. "Mr. President, what do you think about the call to prayer in church? Will this change your policy toward Muslims in America? How do you feel when you hear verses from the Quran being read in front of you?" Trump did not answer right away. Usually he would give an off-the-cuff response, either a sharp comment or a joke that could become the subject of controversy. But this time, he paused, then walked toward his presidential car without saying anything. The White House eventually issued an official statement that Trump's attendance at the event was part of an effort to build unity. But behind his seemingly calm demeanor, there may have been questions in his own mind. Could this moment really reflect reality? Perhaps those questions would not immediately change his policies. But for a man who is used to being in control of situations, this time, he was the one who was stunned by something he had not expected. Meanwhile, other guests attending the event were also lost in their own reflections. A senior Episcopal priest sat on an empty wooden bench, staring up at the cathedral ceiling with teary eyes. "God works in mysterious ways," he whispered to a colleague. A Jewish rabbi sitting not far from Imam Muhammad Mid during the event also seemed pensive, trying to understand how much meaning this moment had, especially at a time when religious tensions are still common. In another corner, a Muslim activist jotted something down in his notebook. For him, it was a historic moment, not just because the call to prayer was being sung inside the church, but because it was a rare occasion for Islam and Christianity to come together in the same space, with such a powerful message of unity. But out there, the world was divided. On social media, a war of words raged. Some saw the moment as a major step toward interfaith tolerance, while others saw it as a violation of the country's identity. But for those in the church that day, both for and against, one thing was undeniable. They had witnessed something that would not be easily forgotten. Inside the ancient cathedral, amid towering pillars and sun-dappled stained glass windows, something rare had happened. The call to prayer had been recited. Verses from the Quran had been recited, and Donald Trump, for the first time, fell silent in reflection. As news of the call to prayer and the recitation of verses from the Quran at the Washington National Cathedral spread around the world, reactions continued to be mixed. Some see it as a symbol of tolerance, some strongly oppose it, and still others see it as a reminder, a reflection of the great stories in history. Amidst the growing discussion, a Muslim academic in America brought up an interesting story in an interview. He said, "What happened in this cathedral is not just a modern event. However, this event also has similarities with historical events in Islam. It reminds us that interfaith interaction has been part of the journey of humanity since ancient times." This statement attracted a lot of attention. If traced deeper, it turns out that there is indeed a historical event from the 3rd century Hijriya that has similarities with what happened in the Washington National Cathedral. In one of the classic Islamic books, it is mentioned that during the time of Abu Yazid al-Bustami, a great Sufi in Persia, an extraordinary event occurred in a church. The story begins when a respected Christian priest was about to give a sermon to his congregation in a crowded church. However, before he could start, he saw a young Muslim sitting among the congregation. The presence of the young man caused astonishment among them. Who is he? Why is he here? What does he want to do? The priest, who was initially hesitant, eventually decided to test the young Muslim with 19 difficult questions about theology and life. The questions were not easy. They were about the concept of God, holy books, miracles in Islam, and other profound questions. In fact, these questions had probably been asked and answered by many people before. However, without hesitation, the young Muslim answered each question clearly and with conviction. He quoted verses from the Quran, explained their meanings, and connected them with logic that was acceptable to the mind. One of the most interesting questions was, what kind of tree has 12 branches, 30 leaves on each branch, and fruit on each leaf? The young man replied, that is a metaphor for the year. The 12 branches represent the 12 months, the 30 leaves represent the 30 days of the month, and the fruit represents the good deeds done every day. This answer, along with other explanations, left the priest speechless in deep contemplation. Finally, after hearing all the answers given by the young Muslim, the priest pronounced the Shahada. But what was more surprising, the church congregation who witnessed the debate also recited the Shahada one by one. This event was later documented in classical books as one of the stories in the life of Abu Yazid al-Bustami. The parallels between the events at the Washington National Cathedral and this historical story are quite striking. In both stories, there is a moment of deep reflection from the Christians who hear the verses of the Quran. In both stories, there is an atmosphere of silence and contemplation after the holy verses of Islam are delivered. Of course, there are differences. Imam Muhammad was not debating or trying to convert anyone. He was simply delivering a message of unity and humanity. However, the effect is the same, the feeling that something great has just happened. Even Donald Trump himself, previously known for his harsh rhetoric against Islam, was seen speechless at that moment. History repeats itself in a different form. In many historical events, we often find a similar pattern. A leader or great figure witnesses something that moves his or her mind. A holy verse or spiritual message is delivered in an unusual place, and the audience who hears it experiences deep reflection. This is not unique to Islam. In the history of other civilizations, there are many examples where words, not swords, have changed people's views on a religion or faith. What happened at Washington National Cathedral may not have been an event that would immediately change the world, but it was a symbol. a sign that interfaith dialogue is still possible, that spiritual language can touch the hearts of anyone, even the most skeptical, and that history often repeats itself in ways we don't expect. Inside that grand, imposing church, the call to prayer had echoed, and for a moment, in the presence of the President of the United States, history came alive. The events at Washington National Cathedral not only caused a wave of emotional reaction, but also sparked a deep intellectual debate among many groups: academics, religious leaders, journalists, and the general public. Many have tried to analyze, interpret, and seek deeper meaning from this event. Was this merely a symbolic moment? Is this a step toward greater tolerance? Or is it a sign of a major shift in Muslim-Christian relations in the United States? Some historians and scholars of religion have begun comparing the event to similar events in history. Some have highlighted how the moment reflects the inclusiveness of some Christian leaders throughout history, while others have compared it to the relationship between the Prophet Muhammad and the Christian community in early Islam. A Harvard University professor of religious studies wrote in an essay, "When the call to prayer sounded in Washington National Cathedral, we were not just witnessing a prayer being said in an unusual place. We were witnessing how religious traditions can come together in a shared space. Throughout history, we have seen many examples of Islam and Christianity sharing spiritual space, and this is one that is still alive today." On the other side of the spectrum, there are also skeptics. A Yale University Christian theology expert stated, "This event is interesting, but we must be careful about interpreting its implications. Is this just a ceremonial moment that will have no lasting effects? Or will it truly change the way we think about interfaith relations?" The Quranic verses recited by Imam Muhammad Mekid were from Surah Al-Hujurat, verse 13, which speaks of unity and respect for differences. The verse has been a major topic of study among some Muslim scholars who have highlighted how the message is relevant not only in the context of Islamic history, but also in the modern world, where issues of racism and inequality remain major challenges. This verse is not just a message for Muslims, it is a universal message. That is why when this verse is recited in a church, its impact is much greater than just a ritual reading, said Dr. Ahmed Yusuf, an Islamic studies expert at Geis University. Among Christian religious leaders, the response to the event was also mixed. Some clergy from the Episcopal Church, which allowed the event to take place, saw it as a step forward in interfaith dialogue. A bishop of the church stated in an interview, "This cathedral has witnessed many historical events. What happened today is not a threat to our faith, but rather proof that God can touch people's hearts in many ways." However, there are also those who consider this event to be crossing theological boundaries. An evangelical pastor strongly criticized the event on television, calling it an act that goes against the principles of Christian faith and mixes different beliefs. "We have given our sacred space to teachings that are contrary to our beliefs. What happened in this cathedral is a betrayal of our faith," a religious leader said in a television interview. While the debate among academics and religious leaders continues to grow, the conversation online is getting more heated. On Twitter and Facebook, discussions are divided into three main groups. Supporters of the event, they see it as a victory for tolerance and unity. Strong opponents, they see it as a dangerous compromise of Christian values. Skeptics, they see the event as nothing more than political drama with no real impact. A journalist from the Washington Post wrote in his opinion piece, "We cannot ignore the symbolic impact of this moment. It is not just about Islam and Christianity, but also about how America, as a religiously diverse country, is managing the enormous challenge of maintaining unity." Why is this event so controversial? There are several reasons why it is so controversial. First, it stands in stark contrast to Donald Trump's political rhetoric. During his campaign, Trump was known for his tough stance on Muslims, even calling for a ban on Muslims entering America. Now he is sitting in a church and listening to verses from the Quran, a sight that would have been unimaginable. But in this event, he sat and listened attentively to the call to prayer and the recitation of the Quran. First, the symbolic meaning of the location. The Washington National Cathedral is not just another church. It is a place of great significance to America, often used for national religious events and a symbol of unity amidst diversity. Second, the issue of Islamophobia in America. Amid rising anti-Muslim sentiment in the United States, this moment has sparked a discussion about the place of Islam in American society. Is this a step toward greater acceptance, or is it deepening the divide? Third, the relevance to history. As discussed earlier, this event has parallels with various historical accounts of the interaction between Islam and Christianity. The scholarly debate that has emerged from this event suggests that its impact is far greater than just a single religious event. For some, it is a sign of hope that Islam and Christianity can share space and dialogue peacefully. But for others, it is a major controversy, a challenge to traditions they believe should remain exclusive. One thing is for sure, the Washington National Cathedral has witnessed something that will be remembered in American history, not only as a religious moment, but as one of the turning points in a major discussion about tolerance, identity, and the future of diversity in the world. The debate that has developed in various circles is getting more heated. The call to prayer that echoed inside the cathedral has caused deep reflection, both for those who witnessed it directly and for the public who followed the news from a distance. However, there was one unexpected moment that happened behind the scenes, something that was not captured by the cameras of the mainstream media. A surprising personal decision. A priest who attended the event finally made a big decision in his life. He was Father Jonathan Edward, a religious figure who had served his community in Washington, D.C. for decades. Widely known for his openness and dialogue with various beliefs, Father Jonathan has always believed that religion is a tool to unite, not separate. However, behind all his openness, he himself experienced great inner turmoil. Ever since he heard the recitation of the verses of the Quran read by Imam Muhammad, his heart trembled. The verse from Surah Al-Hujurat, verse 13, about the unity of people from various tribes and nations, kept ringing in his mind. In the past few decades, he saw how religion was often used as a political tool and a source of division. It made him start to question many aspects of his own beliefs, including the concept of God in Christianity, the Trinity, which he had held tightly to for so long, but now felt shaky to him. He never imagined that the answer to his anxiety would come in the form of a verse from a book that was not his own. From that day on, Pastor Jonathan could not stop thinking about what he had heard. He began to read more about Islam, watch lectures by various scholars, and discuss secretly with some of his Muslim friends. The deeper he searched for answers, the more he became attracted to the concept of Tawheed, the absolute oneness of God in Islam. How could something so simple, so obvious have been right in front of me all this time? But I never really saw it, he wondered. For weeks, he hid his inner turmoil from his fellow pastors. He knew that if he began to show interest in Islam, it would have a major impact on him and his community. But the more he searched for answers, the more he found peace in the teachings of Islam. Finally, he decided to meet Imam Muhammad Maid in person at the Al Jazeera Muslim Society Center. During the meeting, his voice shaking, Pastor Jonathan said, "I never thought I would get to this point, but I want to say that I am ready." Imam Muhammad smiled and said, "Praise be to Allah. God has guided you." After a long discussion, Pastor Jonathan finally uttered the 2 sentences of the Shahada with full conviction. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. I bear witness that there is no God but Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. Tears streamed down his face. He felt like the burden that had been weighing on his soul had been lifted. Pastor Jonathan's big decision to convert to Islam was not something he could hide for long. The news eventually spread among his church, eliciting mixed reactions. Most of his congregation were shocked and felt the loss of a figure they respected. Some fellow pastors criticized him, even accusing him of being a traitor. However, there were also those who were curious and wanted to understand more about Islam. Not a few of his church members began reading the Quran because they wanted to know what had changed the faith of the pastor they had respected. On social media, many comments appeared from his congregation. If our pastor who has studied religion for decades can see something in Islam, maybe I should also find out more. This moment reminds many people of the story of a young Muslim man in the 3rd century Hijri who succeeded in converting an entire church congregation to Islam through a scientific debate. History seems to be repeating itself, but in a different form. If in the story of Abu Yazid al-Bustami, a priest accepted Islam after debating with a Muslim, this time a priest in America accepted Islam after hearing the recitation of holy verses in church. The world witnessed how a verse read in an unusual place could change the heart of someone who had long been searching for the truth. Pastor Jonathan Edwards' decision to convert to Islam came as a big surprise to many people, especially to the church congregation who had long followed his guidance. News of his conversion to Islam spread quickly, not only in the church community, but also in various media. However, an even more surprising incident occurred a few weeks later. Many church congregations began to question their own beliefs and eventually chose to follow in the footsteps of the priest by reciting the Shahada. When Pastor Jonathan pronounced the 2 sentences of the Shahada, his church members began to feel a spiritual emptiness. They wondered, what made the pastor we had respected choose Islam? Is there something in Islam that we have not understood? Is it possible that Islam is the truth that we have been ignoring? Many of them eventually decided to read the Quran in search of answers. Some attended interfaith meetings and discussions with the local Muslim community, trying to understand more about the beliefs that their former pastor now held. One congregation member who had known Pastor Jonathan for more than 20 years said, "Our spiritual guide has found the truth in Islam. Maybe we should find out more too." So I felt the need to at least find out what he had found. Gradually, more and more of them began to feel peace in the teachings of Islam. The concept of Tawheed, or the oneness of God taught in Islam, felt simpler and more reasonable than the concept of the Trinity that they had believed in. A few weeks after Pastor Jonathan converted to Islam, he met with some of his former congregation for a private discussion in his home. They came with questions, curiosity, and open hearts. After hours of talking about the faith, history, and meaning of Islam, one of them said in a trembling voice, "I feel like I've found something I've been looking for." That night, 5 people took the Shahada. In the weeks that followed, the number grew, 10, 20, 30, until more than 100 of Pastor Jonathan's congregation had converted to Islam. This was a wave of spiritual change that was rare in modern American history. The wave of conversions quickly caught the attention of many. The media began covering the phenomenon with varying reactions. Secular media saw it as a unique social phenomenon and tried to analyze its causes. Conservative Christian media saw it as a betrayal of the Christian faith. Meanwhile, international Muslim media saw it as a sign of the growth of Islam in the United States. One major American media outlet headlined it, "From Cathedral to Mosque, How One Pastor Led Hundreds of His Congregation to Islam." Of course, not everyone took this well. Some people in the Christian community considered Pastor Jonathan a traitor. Some even threatened him. However, in an interview, he remained steadfast and replied, "I did not leave Jesus. I actually understood more about the true teachings of Jesus, which taught Tawheed and submission to God Almighty." A few months after this incident, the Muslim community in the city began to provide a place for former church members who had converted to Islam. Many of them became active in the mosque, learning to pray, read the Quran, and deepen their Islam. One of them, who was previously a choir leader at church, is now a muezzin and calls the call to prayer at the mosque. Another, who was previously a Sunday school teacher at church, now teaches Muslim children to read the Quran. They feel that their lives are now more meaningful and full of peace. Pastor Jonathan himself finally officially changed his name to Yahya Edward and began to actively preach. The story of Pastor Jonathan's journey from a pastor to a Muslim has developed into a wave of spiritual change that has affected many people. A joint interfaith prayer has led someone to guidance. One person who received guidance has inspired many others to seek the truth. The truth they found eventually led them to Islam, a religion that gave them peace and new meaning in their lives. This story has reached its climax, but the journey that began at Washington National Cathedral has had an extraordinary impact. From the call to prayer that echoed inside the church, the conversion of a pastor, to the hundreds of congregants who followed in his footsteps, all of this shows how guidance can come in unexpected ways. This story is not just about differences in beliefs, but also about the search for truth, deep reflection, and unity amidst differences. There are several important lessons that can be learned from this event. 1. Islam is a religion of unity. One of the main messages from this incident is that Islam teaches unity, not division. The verses that were chanted in the church were a call for humanity to get to know each other and not hate each other. The interfaith prayer at the cathedral aims to unite people, even though they come from different backgrounds. The search for truth is a long process. The decision of Pastor Jonathan and his congregation to convert to Islam was not due to coercion, but because they found peace in Islamic teachings. This story proves that Islam is not a religion that closes space for seekers of truth. On the contrary, Islam teaches that seeking truth is a process that requires sincerity, perseverance, and sincerity. After conducting in-depth research, they finally found the truth they had been looking for. 3. Guidance comes in an unexpected way. No one expected that the chanting of the call to prayer in the church would change the lives of so many people. A pastor who had spent almost his entire life in Christian teachings is now a devout Muslim. This incident is a reminder that anyone who seeks the truth with a sincere heart will find the right path, even through a path they never expected before. The church congregation who had relied on Pastor Jonathan's guidance now found a new path in Islam. The wider community who witnessed this incident began to open their eyes to Islam as a religion full of peace and truth. This reminds us that Allah gives guidance to whomever He wishes in ways we never expected. Islam is preaching with morals and knowledge. This story emphasizes that Islam is not a religion spread by force or violence. There is no compulsion in religion, and Islamic preaching must be carried out with wisdom, noble morals, and in-depth knowledge. As Allah says in the Quran, "Call humans to the path of your Lord with wisdom and good lessons, and debate them in a better way." QS An-Nahl 125. For Pastor Jonathan, or Yahya Edward as he is now known, his conversion to Islam was not the end of his spiritual journey. Rather, it is the start of a new journey. He now dedicates his life to helping people who want to know Islam more deeply. By sharing the story of his journey, he hopes to inspire others to dare to seek the truth. He tried to spread the message that Islam is not a foreign religion, but a religion that brings peace and coolness to many people. On the other hand, the mosque that was once a small community has now grown into a larger center for dawah. Many of the former church members are now active in the Muslim community, studying Islam in depth and sharing their experiences with others. This incident is a reminder that the light of Islam continues to shine, illuminating sincere hearts in the search for truth. Seek knowledge with an open heart and a clear mind. Islam is a religion of unity and mercy for all nature. Guidance can come at any time and to anyone. The best dawah is dawah that is carried out with good morals and deep knowledge. Maybe we don't experience a big event like what happened at the Washington National Cathedral. Maybe we are not a pastor or someone who argues with church members who have converted to Islam. However, one thing is for sure: everyone has their own journey in seeking the truth. Many church members have begun reading the Quran and found that Islam makes more sense than their old beliefs. The lesson is, we as Muslims must understand Islam better. Don't let someone who has just converted to Islam understand this religion better than we, who were born as Muslims. Many people finally converted to Islam not because of debate or coercion, but because they saw the beauty of a Muslim's morals. If we want others to be interested in Islam, show Islam in our attitudes and behavior. This shows that Islam is a religion that brings light to anyone who seeks it. Guidance can come to anyone and at any time. The search for truth requires courage and sincerity. Islam is a religion of unity and peace, not division. Knowledge is the key to preaching. Islam is a religion that makes sense and brings peace. The best preaching is with noble morals. May this story be a reminder for all of us to continue learning, improving ourselves, and spreading Islam with wisdom and compassion. Let us continue to be good ambassadors of Islam so that more people see the beauty of Islam not only from our words, but also from the way we live and behave well. Friends of the Islamic faith who are blessed by Allah, I hope this video is useful and see you in our next video.